It starts with one diagnosis, right? You get your head around adrenal insufficiency. You learn the meds, the crisis protocols, the salt cravings. You finally feel like you have a handle on it.
And then, in a routine appointment, your endocrinologist drops a new term. Maybe they say Schmidt syndrome, or they mention APS2, or they look at your blood work and say, we need to watch your glucose.
And suddenly, that stability is gone. It feels like a domino effect. You think, is my body failing me again? Is this the start of the end?
Exactly. That spiral, from a single data point to catastrophic thinking, is what we need to interrupt today. Because when we talk about Schmidt syndrome or metabolic risk in the context of Addison's disease, we aren't talking about inevitable doom. We are talking about predictable patterns that, once understood, are actually quite manageable.
We're breaking down the article Schmidt Syndrome, Prediabetes, and Metabolic Risk from My Adrenal Life. We're going to look at why autoimmune diseases like to travel in packs, the specific difference between type 1 and type 2 diabetes risk, which is a huge source of confusion, and how to stop panicking when you hear the words metabolic risk.
It's a heavy topic, but the goal is clarity. Clarity kills fear.
Let's start with the name itself. It sounds incredibly old school. Schmidt syndrome. It sounds like something from a 19th century medical textbook.
It is, essentially. It was coined in 1926 by a German pathologist named M.B. Schmidt. He described two patients who had both Addison's disease, which is the adrenal failure, and chronic lymphocytic thyroiditis, which we now usually call Hashimoto's.
So originally, it was just those two, adrenals and thyroid.
Originally, yes, but medical understanding evolves. Later, around the 1960s and 80s, researchers like Carpenter expanded the definition. They realized that type 1 diabetes, which is also autoimmune, frequently showed up in this same group of patients. So today, the modern medical term is Autoimmune Polyglandular Syndrome Type 2, or APS2.
Okay, APS2 is the technical term, but people still say Schmidt syndrome.
They do. It's shorter for one, but scientifically, APS2 is the umbrella. It's defined as having autoimmune Addison's disease plus either autoimmune thyroid disease, like Hashimoto's or Graves', and or type 1 diabetes.
And this is common? Because the National Institutes of Health classifies it as a rare disease.
It is rare in the general population. Prevalence is maybe 1 in 20,000. But, and this is the big but, if you already have autoimmune Addison's, your risk is much higher. It's the most common of the polyglandular syndromes. And it affects women about 3 to 4 times more often than men.
Why? Why does the body do this? If your immune system has already destroyed your adrenal cortex, why does it decide to go after the thyroid or the pancreas too? It feels personal.
It feels personal, but it's actually genetic. It's about clustering. Think of your immune system like a security guard who's been given a bad set of photos to identify intruders. In people with APS2, there are specific genetic markers, often in the HLA-DR3 or HLA-DR4 regions, that make the immune system suspicious of endocrine tissues specifically.
So it's not that the adrenals failed and caused the thyroid to fail. It's that the underlying error in the security system applies to both.
Precisely. The immune system looks at the adrenal cortex and says, intruder. Then it looks at the thyroid gland and says, you look similar. You're an intruder too. It's a shared vulnerability. That's why your endocrinologist checks your TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, every year. They aren't expecting bad news. They're just checking the surveillance footage because they know the security guard is prone to that specific error.
Okay, that helps reframe the monitoring. It's not a prediction of doom, it's just acknowledging the pattern. But let's get to the part that really scares people, diabetes.
Right.
Because if you have Addison's, you're already managing hormones. You're already dealing with cortisol. The idea of adding insulin to the mix, managing blood sugar alongside blood pressure, is terrifying. But the article makes a very specific distinction here that I think we need to hammer home. The difference between APS2 diabetes and pre-diabetes.
This is critical. If you take nothing else away from this episode, take this. APS2 is associated with type 1 diabetes. Metabolic risk and prediabetes are usually associated with type 2 mechanisms. They are completely different biological pathways.
Walk us through that, because to a patient, high blood sugar is high blood sugar.
On a glucometer, yes, the number looks the same, but the cause is different. In APS2, remember, it's autoimmune. The immune system attacks the beta cells in the pancreas that produce insulin. Eventually, you stop making insulin. That is type 1. It's irreversible and it's genetic.
Okay. And the other one?
The other one is what we see when a doctor says you have prediabetes or your fasting glucose is 110. This is usually resistance. Your pancreas is making insulin, maybe even working overtime, but your cells aren't listening to it. This is the metabolic side. And for Addison's patients, this is often complicated by their medication.
The steroids, hydrocortisone, prednisone.
Right. Glucocorticoids.
There is so much guilt around this. I see it in the forums all the time. People feel like I'm taking this life-saving drug, but is it poisoning me? Is it giving me diabetes?
We need to dissolve that guilt right now. This is physiology, not a moral failure. Cortisol, whether your body makes it or you take it as a pill, is a counter-regulatory hormone. Its job, evolutionarily, is to make sure you have fuel during stress. It literally tells your liver, dump sugar into the blood now. We might need to run from a tiger.
So when you take your morning hydrocortisone, you are chemically signaling the liver to produce glucose?
Yes, through a process called gluconeogenesis. But it does something else too. It goes to your muscle cells and says, don't take up this sugar yet, save it for the brain. It induces a temporary state of insulin resistance. That is what cortisol does. It's a feature, not a bug.
But if you're on replacement therapy, you're just replacing what you don't have. Why would that cause prediabetes?
Because replacement is an imperfect art. Our natural cortisol rhythm is a smooth curve. Pills are spikes. When you take a dose, you might get a transient peak that is higher than physiological normal. That peak tells the liver to dump glucose. Over years, those repeated peaks can contribute to a higher baseline blood sugar.
So when a patient sees their A1C creeping up, say it's 5.8 or 6.0, putting them in that pre-diabetic range, according to the CDC, that doesn't necessarily mean they have the autoimmune APS2 destruction of the pancreas.
Exactly, and that is the reassurance. If it's steroid-induced or metabolic resistance, you have levers to pull. You can adjust the timing of your meds, you can look at diet, you can look at muscle mass because muscle eats up glucose. It's a manageable risk factor, not an autoimmune sentence.
It's interesting you mention muscle because the article touched on weakness. Low cortisol causes weakness, but high cortisol causes muscle wasting. It feels like a tightrope.
It is a tightrope. That's the definition of adrenal insufficiency management. If you under-replace, you risk crisis and hypoglycemia, low blood sugar, which is dangerous in its own right. If you over-replace, you risk metabolic syndrome and insulin resistance.
The article mentions that hypoglycemia, low blood sugar, is actually more common in children with AI, but adults get it too. Why does low cortisol cause low sugar? Is it just the opposite of what we just discussed?
Spot on. Without cortisol, you lose that signal to the liver to release stored glucose. So if you skip a meal or if you exercise hard, your body doesn't have the backup generator to keep your sugar stable. That's why before diagnosis, many Addison's patients present with hypoglycemia.
So let's go back to the patient sitting in the office. They've been told they have metabolic risk or borderline glucose. They immediately think Schmidt syndrome, type 1, forever.
And the doctor needs to clarify. Are we seeing antibodies? Did we test for GAD65 or zinc transporter 8 antibodies? Those are the markers for type 1 autoimmune diabetes.
And if those are negative?
If those are negative, then you are likely dealing with the metabolic side, insulin resistance. And that is not a runaway train. That is a signal to look at your lifestyle and your steroid curve. It's actionable.
I like that distinction, actionable versus inevitable. The article has this phrase, monitoring is preventive, not predictive. Can you unpack that?
Sure. Anxiety tells us that if a doctor is looking for something, they expect to find it. Why are you testing my thyroid every year? You must know it's going to fail. But in the world of APS2, monitoring is just good maintenance. We know the risk is elevated. Maybe 40 to 50% of Addison's patients might develop thyroid issues over their lifetime. If we check TSH annually, we catch it when it's a mild nuisance, not a crisis.
It's like checking the oil in your car. Checking it doesn't mean the engine is broken, it means you don't want the engine to break.
Right. And even with the scarier component, type 1 diabetes, the prevalence in APS2 isn't 100%. It's actually much lower than the thyroid risk. Most people with Addison's will not develop type 1 diabetes. But knowing the symptoms, unexplained thirst, weight loss despite eating, frequent urination, that's just being empowered.
I want to pivot to the emotional side of this clustering. We talked about the biology, but what does it do to a person's identity to collect diagnoses? You start with one rare disease, and then suddenly you might have 2 or 3. It feels isolating.
It can feel like your body is an unsafe place to live. That's the core trauma of chronic illness. But understanding Schmidt syndrome actually connects you to a community. You aren't a medical mystery. You fit a well-documented phenotype. There are thousands of people navigating this exact same constellation of symptoms.
And the treatments are compatible, right? I mean, if you do develop hypothyroidism, you take levothyroxine. If you have Addison's, you take hydrocortisone. Do they clash?
They don't clash, but they interact. This is a crucial nuance for anyone listening who might have both. If you have untreated adrenal insufficiency and you start taking thyroid medication, it can actually precipitate an adrenal crisis.
Wait, really? Why?
Thyroid hormone revs up your metabolism. It makes your liver process cortisol faster. So if you're barely hanging on with low cortisol and you suddenly speed up the clearance of that cortisol, you run out of gas. That's why the golden rule in APS2 is treat the adrenals first.
That is incredibly important practical advice. Steroids first, then thyroid.
Always stabilize the foundation before you build the house.
Let's loop back to the metabolic risk one last time. We established that steroids can cause insulin resistance. Is there anything a patient can do to mitigate that without lowering their necessary dose? Because we don't want people skipping meds to save their blood sugar.
Never skip meds. Low cortisol kills faster than high sugar. But yes, there are strategies. Some endocrinologists split the steroid dose differently, using circadian dosing to mimic the natural curve better, avoiding big spikes late in the day when our natural insulin sensitivity is lower.
And lifestyle?
The standard advice applies, but it's more potent here. Walking after meals. It sounds simple, but it activates the muscles to uptake glucose without needing as much insulin, bypassing that resistance mechanism we talked about. For someone with steroid-induced metabolic risk, a 15-minute walk after dinner is medicinal.
It's gentle empowerment. That's the phrase the article used.
It is. It's moving from my body is breaking down to my body has a unique operating manual and I'm learning how to read it.
So Schmidt syndrome, or APS2, is a real risk. It's the tendency of autoimmune conditions to cluster. But it is not a guarantee that you will get every condition on the list.
Correct. And metabolic risk is a separate bucket, largely driven by the medication we need to survive, and it can be managed with lifestyle and dose tweaking.
And most importantly, a high A1C doesn't automatically mean your immune system is attacking your pancreas.
That's the headline. Don't panic, verify.
It really highlights how complex these systems are. You pull one thread, cortisol, and it ripples through glucose, thyroid, metabolism, but understanding the web makes it less scary.
Knowledge turns a monster into a map. You might still have to navigate difficult terrain, but at least you aren't walking in the dark.
Well said. We've covered the history, the biology, and the psychology of autoimmune clustering. If you know someone navigating a new diagnosis or just spiraling over their latest lab results, send them this episode.